of the quorum call.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Scott Pruitt is the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. He is charged with running the agency and ensuring its mission. There are serious questions about Mr. Pruitt's leadership, but we'll get to that later. Today, the Senate is preparing to vote on the nominee to be the second highest ranking official at the Environmental Protection Agency, Andrew Wheeler. And as the number 2 at the Environmental Protection Agency, Andrew Wheeler deserves the kind of scrutiny that reflects a position one step away from being the administrator. Andrew Wheeler has spent years protecting the coal industry. First, from here in the Senate, where he worked to prevent passage of climate legislation. Then, as a lobbyist for Murray Energy, one of the largest coal companies in America, that has led the fight by the coal industry to undo the progress that we have made on climate policy. Andrew Wheeler's coal credentials are without equal. He is, without question, a member of the coal industry's Hall of Fame. He was even present in March of last year at the meeting when Murray Energy CEO Bob Murray presented Energy Secretary Rick Perry with the now infamous secret plan to save the coal industry. Sadly, I am concerned that Andrew Wheeler's background means that he will never understand that saving coal is not the job of the Environmental Protection Agency. It is the EPA's job to regulate coal, to protect public health and the environment, to prevent particulate matter from filling the lungs of children in our most vulnerable communities, when more than 7,500 people die every year from the pollution from fossil fuel power plants, to reduce the harmful carbon pollution that is causing climate change, to end the toxic coal mining practices that are poisoning our waters and our communities. The corporate special interests who have worked hand in hand with the Trump administration to block clean energy deployment and force Americans to breathe dirty air from fossil fuel combustion are the exactly opposite of what we need to be the head of the Environmental Protection Agency. They are, at the same time, the companies that Andrew Wheeler has represented. Andrew Wheeler has made a career of promoting the policies that make our air and our water dirty and that endanger the public's health. Now, with Environmental Protection Agency Administrator Scott Pruitt under siege as a result of agency mismanagement and scandal, we must have real concern about who will be number 2 at the EPA. Who's on deck to take over if Scott Pruitt has to leave? Who's going to be sitting there in the chair as the administrator to make these decisions about clean air, clean water, about the role which coal plays in polluting our environment? Who will that be if Scott Pruitt were to be removed from his position or resign from his position? And by the way, that is a position which I strongly support, that he be removed, that he resign. But that would then lead to the consequence that Andrew Wheeler would most likely be the new administrator of the EPA. This individual would then be in charge of the environment of our country, in charge of it. The coal industry would have their person running the Environmental Protection Agency. That is unbelievable. That is the dream of the coal industry, that finally, after all these years, they get the guy to be in charge of the environment as the country and the world are moving in just the opposite direction. Now, would he have been vetted for that role as the head of the EPA? Absolutely not. He's out here on a snoozy Thursday afternoon with his name out here to be considered, with the galleries empty of either public citizens or the press paying attention to the debate, when the consequences of this decision that the United States Senate is about to make is of historic magnitude. This man is the coal industry. If you Google the word coal, his picture comes up. Coal, ladies and gentlemen, which has declined from 50% of all electrical generation down to 30% just over the last 10 years. And why? Well, because utilities in America are moving towards wind. They're moving towards solar. They're moving towards energy conservation. They're moving towards natural gas, which is half of the pollutants of coal. The coal industry has met its maker in the marketplace. The utilities themselves have moved towards cleaner sources of electrical generation in our country. And the only way that they can stave off this revolution in their minds is to have a coal industry representative be the head of the Environmental Protection Agency. Talk about the fox guarding the chicken coop. Talk about some kind of upside-down, bizarro world where all of a sudden at the Environmental Protection Agency, the one industry that has most contributed to the greenhouse gases up in our atmosphere over the last 100 years, they now have someone who's next in line to take over the entire Environmental Protection Agency. So Scott Pruitt is under siege. We have not asked Mr. Wheeler about his readiness to lead the EPA or how his policies would be different from those of Mr. Pruitt. We don't have any reason to believe his views are any different than Mr. Pruitt's. Does he agree with the policy direction Mr. Pruitt has taken at the agency? Does he agree with the exorbitant costs associated with the questionable activities Administrator Pruitt has engaged in as head of this agency? There is a lot that Andrew Wheeler has yet to answer to if he were to take over as the head of the Environmental Protection Agency. Which brings us to the embattled EPA Administrator, Scott Pruitt himself. Mr. Pruitt's leadership at the EPA has made that agency as toxic as a Superfund site. Administrator Pruitt has consistently undermined the core mission of the EPA to protect the environment, to protect the health, to protect the safety of all Americans. He has put the interests of the fossil fuel, chemical, and auto industries above the needs of the public's health. Perhaps the best example of Scott Pruitt's war on good, bipartisan policy is his full frontal attack on fuel economy emissions standards. Last week, Administrator Pruitt and the Trump administration began the process of rolling back these historic standards. In 2007, I worked on a bipartisan basis to enact a provision in the energy law that increased our nation's fuel economy standards for the first time in 32 years. It is one of the laws that I am most proud of. I was then serving in the House of Representatives, and I was able to work with Nancy Pelosi, able to work with John Dingell to push through that measure. And over here in the Senate, Dianne Feinstein, working with Senator Stevens and others, were able to bring together, again, a consensus that changed the direction of fuel economy standards in our country. They had not been increased in 32 years because of the grip, the vise-like grip that the auto industry and the oil industry had on public policy making with regard to pollution over the preceding 32 years. It was a tragedy. It was a disgrace. It was harmful to the health of Americans, to the national security of Americans, to the economy of Americans. But yet, they had the power to do it. But this world changed for the first time in 2007. And then building on that law, in 2009, the Environmental Protection Agency and the Department of Transportation began negotiating an historic agreement with state regulators, automakers, labor unions, and the environmental community. And in 2012, the landmark fuel economy emission standards of 54.5 miles per gallon by 2025 got placed on the books. And consulting with states and auto manufacturers, environmental groups, and other experts, the EPA and the National Academies of Sciences have proved beyond a doubt that the existing standards are appropriate. Automakers are meeting these standards more quickly and at a lower cost than predicted. These fuel economy standards are technically feasible, they're economically achievable, and they have revived the competitiveness of our domestic auto industry, which has added 700,000 new jobs since 2010 and sold a record number of vehicles in 2015 and again in 2016. But Scott Pruitt is threatening American consumers, our national security, and our climate by trying to slam the brakes and make a U-turn on this critical policy. We cannot allow Scott Pruitt to put us in reverse on these strong standards. But it doesn't stop there. Time after time, Scott Pruitt has undermined the core mission of the EPA to protect the environment, to protect the health, to protect the safety of all Americans. The litany of Scott Pruitt's sins is a big oil wish list: repealing the Clean Power Plan, supporting withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord, weakening the Clean Water Act and allowing more toxic pollution into our streams and our wetlands, loosening standards for hazardous pollutants like mercury and arsenic and lead that corporations can spew into our air. With Scott Pruitt's actions at the EPA, more Americans would get sick, more children could get asthma, more people could die. He has shut out the public from the EPA rulemakings and decisions, and during his tenure, the EPA has hidden countless thousands of pages of publicly funded reports on climate science and other topics from the EPA's main webpage. Now, it is emerging that he has betrayed the trust of the American people by pursuing ethically questionable behavior while heading this agency. His mismanagement of the EPA, his intimidation of scientists, amongst whom fear is rampant, and his insistence on undermining key environmental policies is unacceptable. It is impossible to have any confidence in him to lead this agency. It is time we issue an eviction notice, change the locks, kick Scott Pruitt out of the EPA. It is time for him to go. But amidst this dark cloud, it is up to the Senate to ensure that anyone who is going to be responsible for overseeing our nation's environmental policy is properly vetted for that position. Without more questioning, more examination, we do not know if Andrew Wheeler is that individual. And ultimately, I cannot vote for a lobbyist for the coal industry to lead the agency that is tasked with making sure that carbon pollution is regulated. And so that's the decision that we're being called upon to make here. It's like a shadow confirmation vote for the next administrator of the EPA. It's an attempt to slip by at the end of the week with members of the Senate wanting to get home the nomination and confirmation of a man who stands for just the opposite of what the credentials of a candidate to run the EPA should be. We've got a massive wind revolution in our country. We have 260,000 people now working in the solar industry in America. There are 50,000 coal miners, 260,000 people in solar, 100,000 people in wind, and most of the wind and solar jobs were created over the last 10 years. Which direction does President Trump go? Which direction does Scott Pruitt go? Which direction will Andrew Wheeler, the heir apparent to Scott Pruitt, go? It goes towards coal and not wind, not solar, not renewable energy, not this greatest creation of blue-collar jobs in 2 generations in a single job sector. 2% of all new workers in America last year were solar workers who got hired, and they're good jobs. But who are they? They're electricians up on the roof. They're people who are carpenters. They're putting together the equipment. They're blue-collar workers, high-paying, secure, long-term jobs. The president, however, looks to the coal industry with 50,000 coal miners and says, I'm going to put in place a man who is committed to protecting that industry while destroying coal, and by destroying, rather, the wind and the solar and the renewable industry in general, and by saying to the automotive industry, you do not have to any longer increase dramatically the fuel economy standards of the vehicles which we drive in our country. Elon Musk, all these smart, technologically savvy people in our country who are reinventing the way in which we drive, they're being told, no, the standard is too high. Your goal cannot be achieved. We're going to roll back those goals. That's Scott Pruitt. That's Andrew Wheeler. That's Donald Trump. That's what this debate is about out here on the floor. It's a debate about the future of our country. It is a debate about the future of our planet. It is about the future of the direction which we are going to be heading in. Are we going to be looking at the world in a rearview mirror back towards a technology of the 19th century coal, or are we going to be looking towards the future? And that future is one of solar and wind. It's renewable energy. It's all electric vehicles. It's a revolution that saves the planet, creates jobs, protects our security by backing out imported oil from other countries. The fuel economy standards in our country that are on the books right now that Scott Pruitt and Donald Trump want to roll back out 3.5 million barrels of oil a day that we never have to import from OPEC, from the Middle East. Do you know how many barrels of oil we import each day from the Middle East? 3.5 million barrels of oil. That should be our goal. The president right now is debating whether or not he should have more missile strikes into Syria in the Middle East. What would be the impact in Iran? What would be the impact in Saudi Arabia? But meanwhile, simultaneously, out here on the floor, we're debating a nominee who is going to be the hand-picked successor to Scott Pruitt to water down those fuel economy standards, to water down that protection which we're giving to young men and women, that they won't have to go over to the Middle East in order to protect those ships of oil which come into our country. And that is just morally indefensible when we know that these revolutions are moving, that they're creating jobs, that they're working. So that's why this nomination here today goes right to the heart of the future of our country and the future of our planet. That's who Andrew Wheeler is. He represents the worst of what this Trump administration is trying to do to our country. We should be the leader, not the laggard. We should be the point of light for the planet. going to a goal that we know can then be exported around the rest of the world. That's what the 21st century should be all about. That children have to look back in the history books to find that there ever was a time when we were burning coal that was polluting the lungs of children and the planet, when we had a chance to move towards wind and solar and renewable energy and all electric vehicles. That should be our goal here today. That's why I urge in the strongest possible terms of rejection of his nomination. We should be having a full-blown debate, not this truncated process that's being imposed upon us here today. This is just plain wrong. This nomination is too important. This is the heart of what the green generation in America want us to debate. Which way are we going, backwards or forwards? Which way are we going, towards a clean planet or a further polluting of the planet? Pope Francis, in his encyclical, made it very clear. One, that the world is dangerously warming. Two, that it is being caused largely by human activity. And three, that we have a moral responsibility to do something about it as the principal polluter over the last 100 years. Because number four, those who are going to be most adversely affected are the poorest and most vulnerable on the planet. And we have to do something about it. That's why a no vote today is correct, because Andrew Wheeler is going to take us in the wrong direction, just the opposite of where Pope Francis urged us to go. And so with that, Mr. President, I yield back the balance of my time. And I will yield the rest of my time to Senator Copper.
I'm so yielding.